We will now be interviewing a group of people about what they think was the cause of sectionalism, secession, and the Civil War.
The Missouri Compromise was one of the leading causes of the war. California wanted to come in as a free state in the Union, and this would unbalance the ratio of free to slave states. With the compromise established by Henry Clay, California would come in as a free state, and the fugitive slave law would be enforced. Although the North was able to get California as a free state in the Union, the fugitive slave law was seen as a negative in the North because runaway slaves or free slaves would be able to be enslaved again. The South saw this as a positive because they could take their slaves back and use them for labor again. This led to the Civil War because people in the North didn't want slavery anymore, while the South did. The tension of the two regions caused disputes and eventually war.
Manifest destiny was a popular term used. This enthusiasm for expansion was influenced by nationalism, increased population, economic growth, and reform ideas. John O'Sullivan came up with a name for this enthusiasm, which is the belief that America was destined and responsible to dominate westwards. Southerners were huge supporters of manifest destiny in order to gain land for crops and bring slaves. Opportunity for economic growth was seen. For Northerners, manifest destiny wasn't hugely needed. Focusing more on industrializing, westward expansion wasn't immediately necessary. This expansion idea was slowly developed over time into action as America slowly expanded. This brought up the question of whether states should be slave or free. In order to not upset the balance in Congress, this question was often argued.
The Mexican-American War was a war between the U.S. and Mexico over land and Americans violating their laws. The North viewed the war as a Southern attempt for expansion of slavery, but the annexation of Texas into the U.S., disputes over laws and boundaries, the Rio Grande as it was a border, and that the U.S. was granted the Mexican cession. The Nebraska Act and elections in Kansas began with Senator Douglas when he wanted to build a transcontinental railroad into the North. To get his bill passed, he also created the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act was used popular sovereignty to decide whether or not Kansas and Nebraska should have slavery. Northerners were angry because the Missouri Compromise said that there would be no slavery in the north of the 36-30-degree line, which meant that there should not be none in Kansas and Nebraska. Bleeding Kansas would create sectionalism by proving that the North and South cannot compromise without creating violence or a great deal of friction between the people of each region.
Dred Scott's Supreme Court case brought an ethical issue into the picture. The fugitive slave law allowed for Dred Scott to be captured, and the Second Great Awakening caused the moral view on the case. This was the case when Dred Scott sued Missouri for being captured under the fugitive slave law. It was ruled that Dred Scott had no power to sue, not being a citizen. It also ruled that slaves were now property, allowing slaves to be taken anywhere. The North was bothered by this ruling, causing the Missouri Compromise to be ruled unconstitutional because it limited where slaves can be taken. This court case fueled a fire that was upset about the moral stance on slavery. Owning another human being was taken into a different point of view now.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates. While Lincoln and Douglas were facing off to become the Illinois senator, debates were about slavery and expansion. Lincoln believed it should not expand and attacked Douglas over his lack of position in the issue. Republicans gave more support to Lincoln because he supported their views. Democrats and Southerners saw Lincoln as the opposite and did not support them. Douglas's lack of position led him to lose the election of 1860, which was the turning point that caused the Civil War.
The novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the leading causes of the war. Northerners were becoming anti-slavery, and many wanted to know why to become against slavery. This book persuaded many to go against slavery because it portrayed cruelty to the slaves in the book. Tom the slave was being cruelly treated by the slaveholder in the book. Northerners saw this book as a wake-up call to go against slavery, while the Southerners condemned the untruths of it and the cruelty shown about slavery. This led to the Civil War because people wanted to abolish slavery while the South wanted to keep it. This created endless disputes and eventually the Civil War.
Event of John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry event. When John Brown and his brothers grouped up and gathered Northern followers to raid Harper's Ferry and gathered guns and resources for an uprising. John Brown raided Harper's Ferry to gather guns and resources to give slaves for an uprising to help them escape. but John paid for it by having him and his brothers get hung and executed for the most part. The North viewed John as Brown and his raid as a type of heroism and called him a martyr, but the Southern point of view saw him as what nowadays call him a terrorist for his attempt of an uprising. This helped the South decide to leave since it was an attempted terrorist attack and violated many rights between the North and South.
The election of Abraham Lincoln is the last event on this roller coaster of sectionalism. Increased sectionalism was at an all-time high between the North and the South. The breakup of the Democratic Party had happened just before this. John Brown's raids also happened just before the election, showing that the brink of crisis was at this election. Before the election, the Southern states threatened to succeed the Union if Lincoln was nominated and won the election of the 1860. He won all of the free northern states, which won him the Electoral College but not the popular vote. The Southern states kept their promise and succeeded soon after. The Northern states strongly supported Lincoln's view on slavery, wanting to contain it, while the South saw Lincoln as trying to destroy slavery. This election was the straw that broke the camel's back and brought all the tension to a head and showed the division in the country. It was because of this election that the Southern states succeeded.
The events explained in the video before, from the Northern and the Southern point of view, hopefully together, as the United States have learned from the secession and Civil War and what caused it and how it happened, and hopefully not make these mistakes again for future references.